welcome to Food for Thought, the climate cost of our eating habits. Really happy to have you joining us today. I'm Roman Chenet. My co-presenter, Dr. Alistair Smith, will be joining us soon. And we're inviting you into our kitchens and into our minds to consider how food operates and the hidden costs and the spiraling costs that they involve nowadays. So thank you so much for joining. Just before we kind of kick off, and I'm going to hand over to Alistair in a moment, I would like you to please, in the comments, share what the last food or drink item that you consumed was. As you can see, mine is a cup of tea. So I'm just going to wait for a few comments to come through. But in the meantime, Alistair, if you want to set up and take it away, what we'll do is Alistair will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back to me, and then I'll do a show and tell with stuff from a weekly shop that we can think more deeply on. There you are.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Roman, for your introduction. I'm looking forward to seeing what foods people have consumed recently. And I have to, I suppose, apologise. I think I'm going to develop the express intention to sort of destroy your appetite and put you off any food you might be looking forward to in the future. Be they 2 slices of bread and a toasted tea cake from one contributor there. Avocado and prawns, very nice. Well, I'll leave those comments to come in. But in the meantime, I'll if I could move to my slides, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you to provide some hopefully very provocative food for thought, and to think about the real economic and social costs of our food. Now, as I say, I might have expressed intention to sort of try to dissolve your appetite, and there's 2 reasons for that. So first of all, I'm afraid this presentation does involve some graphs. I want to show you, possibly for the first time in a good while, some graphs that I think should make hopefully some sense to you and should make a meaningful difference. Obviously, I looked around for comedy graphs, and a pie graph, a pie chart, was the best one I could find to open with. So in the spirit of this graphic, I want to use graphs hopefully to engage you and to invite you into to thinking maybe in a different way than you have before about food. The other reason that I feel this presentation might be a bit off-putting in terms of your appetite is I want to think very seriously about what I have come to understand as the hidden cost of food. Now, I take as another starting point a headline from recent media which covered events in South Africa, and here we saw an interconnection between the rising cost of food and prices and what many people would look on as a very undesirable social situation. And my essential argument is that while we often think about these events as being contained to other parts of the world and experiences of other people, I have reason to believe that we need to shift our perception of how these things work. And in fact, I would like to expressly agree with various perspectives provided by speakers on behalf of Extinction and Rebellion. Now, they suggest to us that the reason we should be concerned about climate breakdown isn't to do with the environment or polar bears. It's because the real end game of this and the real outcome of this potential future scenario is what they refer to as a social collapse. Now, if you're maybe at this point thinking you're a bit worried about what I'm going to say, maybe this seems a bit extreme, a bit radical, a bit unsubstantiated, I want to quickly also point out that we're not the only ones making this argument in the world. You may well be familiar with the character of Sir David Attenborough, who has dedicated his life to understanding and engaging the public about the ecology of our world. He has also been very prominent in saying that he believes what we are facing is what he refers to as a civilizational collapse. If we do not deal with the challenges of the climate emergency, of global heating and climate disruption that we increasingly have good reason to believe we are facing. In the broad spirit of all of these actors, what I want to do is to try to make an argument which I have reason to believe is a step in starting to tell the truth about the nature of the world that we live in and the relationship between food and the climate emergency. So by the end of this, I'll be very interested to hear and to understand how credible you find my position. So the place that I would like to start is just sort of connecting with stories that you might well have heard about the relationship between food and climate. And these are the stories that people have, I guess, told you, been willing to tell you, or have found themselves presenting. Now, I think it's certainly true, and would agree with corporate actors, so such as prominent food manufacturers, so Heinz, that point out that food prices have gone up recently, and it's something that we should get used to. And I think when corporate actors start telling us this, it's something to really listen to. This is not something a company wants to be saying because it wants its food products to be competitive. We are being encouraged to understand that this is the reality in which we now live, and this is the future that we face. We may have also started to experience this possibly. I don't know the geographic origin of where many of you are based at the current time, but if you've lived in Europe, you may have seen headlines like this. So because of certain weather patterns, there's been a very poor season for the growing of wheat, which produces pasta. And a month or so ago, The Guardian suggested that we were in the UK looking at prices that would be increased by about 50%. So this is something that we already can see if we pay enough attention. Now, sitting behind this is a wider change. So in all food prices, and you may well have seen headlines like this. So that world food prices on the international market have been identified to have hit a 10-year high. And now this is according to data which is constantly collected and analysed by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. So this is the FAO, and this discussion, the story has been quite prominent. So you'll see my headline comes from the Reuters News Consolidation Organization. So this is then spread pretty much throughout the world. So this is a story that you might have likely heard. This gets reproduced in lots of different places in lots of different ways. So here we have the Financial Times telling us that the cost of your breakfast, for some reason they're interested in breakfast, I guess because of cereals, is hitting a 10-year high. Now here we start to see the relationship between food and climate, which makes sense. Bad weather is part of this story, but also supply chain problems for putting ingredients together. So this is a 10-year high, according to the Financial Times. Just to sort of emphasize, this is a fairly standard story that's getting told across both media, but also, I guess, more serious business-facing publications and commentary. So here we have the Oxford Business Group attempting to provide sort of commercial insight, and they have a similar headline. Why are food prices at this kind of 10-year high? And just to point out down the bottom here, the 10-year high, and all this data is getting drawn from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization. This is the main global source of this data. So I promised you some graphs to try to encourage you that they are interesting and not necessarily scary and boring. So this is the Food and Agricultural Organization, the way that they present their data on global food prices. Now, I'm not too convinced by the formatting of this. I think it doesn't come out too well. So I'm going to provide an alternative to this graph in a moment, which is my own. And in so doing, I want to move on to tell you some stories that I think you haven't been told and that you aren't aware of, but that are very important, in my view, to understand, for us to think about the interactions between climate, food, and the true costs that are interconnected here. Now, this is my version of the FAO graph. It's exactly the same data. I've just tried to make it a little bit clearer. And I'd like to sort of start to talk you through the different bits of this, which I hope you'll find interesting and valuable. Now, the important starting point here is that all these stories come out of looking at one of these particular lines on this graph. and in this case, it's the nominal set of values, as the arrow is pointing to here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fade out the real line for a moment. So here we have the nominal price. And what we see here in the data set is international food prices, all the different food commodities put together, represented in an index to see change over time. And what we see here is the cost of food prices growing from the early 1960s when the data starts all the way through, and we can see the fluctuations too, all the way through. The most recent data is from September 2021. And if we look at this graph, we can see where the story that the current food prices in 2021 are indeed now as high as they were 10 years ago. So back in 2011. This makes sense. Hopefully we read the graph in this way. There are some important additional details, however, that maybe haven't crept into the story. So back in 2011, there was a series of social processes going on. A number of governments were overthrown. Sometimes this is popularly referred to as the idea of the Arab Spring. So Libya and Egypt were examples where people took to the streets and they used a variety of mechanisms to remove the governments in power, also backed by international interests. This was a complicated situation. But one of the key characteristics of this situation was the level of food prices. Cereals, and therefore the production and availability of bread, was particularly problematic at this stage. So it's considered that at least this was a kind of a compounding and a contributing factor to some serious social unrest that created serious change. So now let's have a think about what this series of nominal price index represents, and this is where it unfortunately might put you off your dinner. It gets potentially a little bit technical, but I'm hoping that I can explain it in a way that we can everyone can follow my story. So nominal prices are kind of the cash prices that people will pay in real life, if you like. It's about monetary value, and the reason that this particular price is focused on is because it's the most meaningful in terms of people's lives. This is the prices that are paid out there when you buy things, be it on the international market or elsewhere. But in order to create analysis, economists also talk about something which is related but different, and this is the real price of goods and commodities and services. So what this price does is it takes the nominal price, the kind of the cash price you might pay on the street, so to speak, and it makes an adjustment for changes in inflation. What it tries to say is this is less about just the kind of the price you might pay in money, but it tries to create a better representation of how difficult it is to buy certain products, or conversely, how your income might be faring over time. It essentially provides a more accurate picture to understand the opportunities that people have in an economy. So we often talk about this in terms of wages. So you might have heard the idea of kind of nominal wages and real wages. And this is important for life. So when your boss next tells you they're going to give you a wage increase, ask them if that will be a nominal wage increase. So are they just talking about the sort of the number of extra pounds per hour or whatever they will give you, or more accurately, like a percentage increase? Or are they talking about a real wage increase in terms of actually allowing you to, with this new wage, to buy more goods and services in an economy? Because what normally happens is that while your wage might increase by, let's say 5%, if the costs of everything you want to buy have increased by 10%, actually your real wage increase is, in many cases, is negative. So you aren't better off. The number of your wages got bigger, but your ability to buy things has actually been reduced. And hence my kind of graphic here, the idea that these workers are earning more and more in a nominal sense, but in a real sense, they're actually not better off, although they often think they are, because very few people talk about this distinction. To shift it away from wages and to help us think about food now. So if obviously one of the major kind of costs of life is buying food. So if the nominal price of food is going up, this is going to affect any kind of real value change in your wages. But at the same time, it's very unlikely that it'll be just food prices that are increasing. It's actually the prices of everything. So not only is food getting more expensive in a nominal sense, the number that you are required to pay for, let's say, 1 unit of corn is getting bigger, because you have to also spend more and more on units of everything else that you want to buy, your childcare, your tuition fee, or your rent, your housing. Actually, your overall ability to buy food is reducing quite significantly. Therefore, you are less food secure because food is less accessible to you. So I hope this makes some sort of sense, because I'd like to use this to shift now the bit of the graph that we're looking at here from the nominal over to the real. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to fade out the nominal and keep us with the real, because this, in my opinion, is the best way to understand how accessible food is at the international level. Now, here we see from the 1960s going forward, this is very different to the nominal graph that we had before, because in fact the real price of food decreased from the 60s through to somewhere around the middle of this graph. So this represents food at the international level being more accessible to buy. The real cost was lower. But then something a bit interesting starts to happen, and we could put this box in a variety of places on this slide, but I've chosen 2000 because I think it makes sense. And it also interests me because the year 2000 was when we introduced collectively, globally, the Millennium Development Goals. And as part of that, we wanted to eradicate extreme poverty and also hunger. But that job was very difficult because immediately we introduced these goals, the real price of food starts getting expensive on the international market. We can see the index rising. Then if we zoom in a little bit later, say around 2015, when the Millennium Development Goals move to be the Sustainable Development Goals, and they become many more and numerous, we still have hunger. In fact, now our aspiration is to zero hunger. So not just to reduce it, but to wipe out hunger altogether. We see fluctuations in the real price, but then it most recently has absolutely skyrocketed. And this makes the task of reducing hunger to zero much more difficult. If we now step back and look at what's happened over the entire history of this data, we actually see that not only is food more expensive than it was 10 years ago, that's already happened. We could have observed that a number of months ago, but we see that food is now more expensive in real terms, therefore less accessible than it has been for the entirety of all the 2000s, all the 1990s, all of the 1980s, the vast majority of the 1970s, and then all of the 1960s. So another way of saying this is that actually the ability of people to obtain food on the international market is now pretty much one of the highest or sort of most difficult situations than it's ever been in our history. And all of this is despite all the efforts and investment that's gone into trying to do the opposite. So this isn't a particularly impressive situation. And this isn't a story that you'll hear a lot. This is something that I've published on a bit myself, and we're starting to see the story expand. But tonight's presentation is part of trying to kind of drive that wider awareness. Something interesting about the reference point of the 1970s, when yes, in real terms, food, the very two only other years in history when food was technically more expensive, was genuinely more difficult to access on the international market. There was an oil crisis, so petrochemical fuels were very, very expensive. This is what drove the crisis then, and that might actually sound a little bit familiar to what we're experiencing today. So I now want to talk about a few other things that I think maybe you might know, because we're always asked, well, what's going on at the moment? Why do we have this? What in reality is not historically unprecedented, but is one of the highest food price index values we've ever seen. Now, a lot of the headlines quite rightly point to the COVID pandemic. This has had all sorts of complex impact on the whole global economy, of course, including food production. What's interesting is we see part of this headline, the idea that maybe improving trade could help and therefore sort of bring down international food prices. And I think this is very fair. So forgive the lack of sources. I can follow up later with this. But this shows the unit cost of buying international shipping. So from we've got May 2021 to September, this has grown significantly. And this is again a complex product of all sorts of things going on. Very much linked to, or partly linked to, the COVID pandemic. But then there's a few things that I think probably have not filtered through to your understanding of the relationship between the costs of food and what's been going on in terms of the environment and how this relates to the climate emergency. Now, the overall price index is made up of different categories. So this is interesting because we can start to look and see, well, which are the categories where the price is growing the most? And we can start to sort of diagnose and analyze and explain what's driving these things. And my argument here is that these are indicative of what happens in a climate emergency when there is a changing climate. So the first thing with vegetable oils, which you can see from the green line, has been a very strong driver of the increase in food price index. Now, this from the Food and Agricultural Organization's report, they say there's been a demand for biofuel and biodiesel. And this is an indirect result of a changing climate. We are wanting to move away from carbon fuels, oil, etc. So we are looking for vegetable-based oils. But of course, if we grow oil for fuel sources, that oil is not then available to consume in food products. So there's a competition and the price is driven. So this is indirectly related to our changing climate. But we can also see direct relationships between the nature of the climate and more specifically weather and rising food prices. Now, all these reports sound very technical and kind of difficult to understand, but when we look through them, we find time and again expressions like this. So there's been reduced supply because of poor weather conditions. There's been concerns over dryness. There's been continued dry weather. And this is a representation that in 2021, we still have a fairly significant inability to predict and understand what's going to happen with weather, and that affects our food prices. We can't balance supply and demand. So we're already struggling. So this is not to say that these prices are going up because of climate change. I think that is part of the case. But what we can very much say is that if the climate continues to break down in the way we predict, and therefore our ability to predict and manage weather reduces, not increases, we can only see the direction of travel. Prices will continue to rise, and this will be a problematic situation. If we look into the category of sugar, again, drier than normal weather conditions. Sounds kind of technical, sounds kind of neutral, but actually what we're saying there is we didn't know what was going to happen because the weather was too varied and we couldn't manage that. And therefore there wasn't enough supply, the price went up. Conversely, we can see very clearly what happens when weather is relatively stable and predictable. This is when production is good and prices are low. We can see here what is very likely to happen if we allow climate change, climate disruption to continue. And I think this is something we should be seriously concerned about. Not least because we can already see situations like this. So these are cereal crops. And the graphic here we have shows, so the orange line being production, the dotted yellow line being utilization or demand, and the bar graph being the global stocks, so the balance that we've got. And these are all types of cereal. The most important thing about this category is that it is hugely important for our global food supply system and for our diet. In fact, so taking a point of reference from the literature, about 50% of all people alive on the planet rely upon cereals as their major kind of calorific intake, so their major source of nutrition. When we look at what's happening here, so why is it that supply was less than demand? And why is it that according to these bar graphs, the global stock of food is decreasing? Well, going back to the pasta thing, it's largely, most recently, to do with poor weather conditions. Now, a lot of other things happened between 2017 and now, so this isn't totally the result of climate change and unpredictable weather. But again, we can see what happens into the future. If we can't produce enough to match the demand, we're going to reduce stocks. And linking back to my major theme, I would say that while I have no reason to believe that this is the end of the world, i.e. running out of food or running out of cereals. I think when the end of the world does happen, if we do experience civilizational collapse, we will see graphs that look a lot like this. But instead of picking up, eventually they will continue to decline and cause serious social pressures. We've already seen it in a sort of a modest price rise in pasta, but I think what we're going to see is something much more serious. So drawing these things together in conclusion, in the UK at the moment, of course, the British government is hosting the COP26, so the Conference of the Parties, where representatives of governments from all over the world are trying to address the climate emergency. And the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has been very forthright in saying, if we do not act now, it'll be too late. And I think he's not right in the sense that I think it's already too late. But it is a question of the more that is done, the easier and the sort of the better the future will be, or less worse, let's say. And I think Boris Johnson has a very strong motivating factor, because whether he realizes it or not, I think what he's facing is a very serious social situation. Now, if we look at UK inflation, so this is the collective kind of cost of people buying goods and services, we see it's increased significantly and in an historical way over many multiple years to 3.1%. Now, we also know, linking this to food, that a portion of this is to do with increases in the price of buying food and buying drink. So food is getting less accessible in the UK at the moment. That is happening. And if you're a politician, you should be worried about this. However, I think a lot of people are very unsure as to quite how this then maps into the British government's own policy. So despite this situation, the government have just reduced duty on domestic air travel, which is designed to stimulate the economy, but will have a huge carbon impact on the world, the equivalent of many, many extra train journeys. And we've also seen in recent headlines that campaigners and analysts are saying we need to stop flying a whole lot more. The worst type of flight, arguably, is a domestic flight over such a short distance because it's not necessary. So the government here are entirely contradicting their kind of own claims, and I would say their own interests. They are not able to appreciate the full gravity of the situation that I think we're all facing. The other step that the British government have recently made is to reduce universal credit, which provides basic support for some of the most marginalised and poor families in Britain. So they are behaving in a way that's not fit for purpose in terms of climate change. They are also undermining the ability of poorer people to be able to afford food that is growing significantly in cost. And I think there is a serious social pressure being created there. So I'm going to draw it to a close now, and I want to refer back to Sir David Attenborough. And I want you to remember this. The next time you hear Sir David Attenborough talk about the civilizational collapse being on the horizon, I don't want you to think of other people in other parts of the world. Necessarily, I want you to think about some of those examples. So to think about how food prices and the increasing cost of bread played into revolutions in Libya and Egypt in 2011. But I also want you to think about what happened in London, in the UK in 2011, when a group of marginalised people basically decided that they'd had enough and they started to take some of the only action they had. And that was to take to the streets to protest. We think we're insulated from these things in countries where this happens rarely. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's very contextually dependent. And the future I see is a head towards this direction. So that for me is an important set of stories around the real cost of food and the hidden economic costs here. So I will hand back, I think, to Roman to see where we're heading next.
Thank you, Alistair. Gosh, so after all that, I might take the tone down a little bit, but I think I need a drink just to start off. And this section is going to be a show and tell of a weekly shop that helps to translate what Alistair's been very eruditely explaining in a very kind of perhaps intentionally mundane way. Okay, so I know it's a bit late for it, but being continental, I do like an evening coffee sometimes. So coffee's gotten really expensive. Coffee beans have risen about 60% just in the past year. Never mind, over the past decade. And even cheap coffee has gotten pricey. I've got some here. So, your kind of bog standard cheap coffee that, you're going to buy is going to be kind of way pricier now than it would be. The own brand ground coffee in my local shop has increased from about £1.20 to £2. So that's 60%. It's about right. And instant coffee, my old friend here, tells a very similar story. You're unlikely to find a decent one for less than £2 per 100 grams. Whereas back in the day, in the glory days of my coffee drinking youth, it wasn't like that. And we need to bear in mind that coffee companies themselves have responded to these increases in prices, often by making coffee more upmarket. So frequently doing quite odd things like adding ground coffee into instant coffee and making it like a special product, and other branding type initiatives to make it seem more upscale and more upmarket. The reality is it's still 98% instant coffee with a bit of, magic ground coffee into it, which is kind of the same thing. But what this does is it doesn't only allow the companies to raise the price of your morning cup, but also helps to absorb these increasing costs of coffee beans that I've just talked about, which are, linked to what Alistair has been explaining. And that, in addition to, of course, the many supply chain costs that go into us being able to enjoy our morning addiction, as it were, get us out of bed. And on that note, do you know how many steps are involved in bringing a coffee to your cup and transforming the humble coffee berry into what you recognize as your mug of coffee? So it's basically about 10 steps involved. So it's the berries are grown, they're picked, they're processed, then they're milled to get the bean out of the berry. That's when it starts becoming a bean. Then they're roasted. Then they're packaged, the bean gets shipped. Then it gets unpackaged, ground up into the ground coffee. You may do this at home. I don't have a coffee grinder, so I rely on someone else doing it for me. It is then brewed, so you may be quite familiar with that, whether you use a filter machine or a mocha pot or a French press, or indeed the humble instant. And then finally, the 10th step is the drinking of it. Okay, so we can see how even quite a mundane and straightforward everyday product that many of us may know of, at least, even if we don't consume it, has a lot going into it. And at every stage of that process, there is a supply chain involved, right on up until you have the product in your hands. And, of course, the story is quite similar with, a nice bit of hot chocolate, or if you like a bit of tea, you can see I've stocked up. It's a similar story in terms of prices, less dramatically so for tea, but we have to bear in mind that, at the start of this country's love affair with tea as a classic type beverage, it was a very expensive and premium product, whereas now it has become very commonplace and cheap through industrial production. But that may not last, right? So these things will go in cycles. And it also suggests how messaging such as what we are sharing today may help contribute to the coffee getting cheap again. Rejoin the tea. But, so fair enough. We've had a drink. Let's think about having a snack. So I'm trying to be good before Christmas ruins it. So let's start with some fruit. So I've got some raspberries here. Yummy. These come from Portugal. Okay, so they were picked quite recently. They were in a field in Portugal. They were picked by someone probably being paid too little for work that's too hard, and then were flown over to land in my shopping trolley. Right. What else do we have? So, as we know, tomatoes are fruit, everyone, and they came from Morocco. So similar kind of story, similar kind of warmer climate. You could say the same for bananas. Where have these come from in the world? Somewhere in the rainforest. Does it say? Apologies for the rustling. Dominican Republic. Okay, there's a joke in there somewhere. So we've thought about food a bit. So, well, okay, it comes from all over the world. And, you know, in a sense, we're very lucky to be living in this day and age where we can enjoy these natural products from far-flung regions. The question is, do we really need to be ingesting everything from all these countries, thinking about the climate costs that we have just looked at and that are, of course, very prominent in the news nowadays with COP26? So, tough one. We have to bear in mind that, you know, every tiny bit, you know, every part of this tomato and of these raspberries has a carbon cost that's well beyond just the, you know, the kind of things you might obviously think about. Not to mention the blinking plastic and everything, right? That everything's wrapped in and protected and insulated in. So Alistair used the word insulation. We can think about how our food habits have insulation in multiple levels. Okay. So after all that air travel, I think we all need to hydrate a little bit. So I'm going to hydrate with my old friend, some bottled water. Let's talk about it. So in the UK, the bottled water industry is worth approximately £1.5 billion a year. How much plastic does that involve? A lot. In the UK, we throw out 7.7 billion plastic water bottles a year. Whether they get recycled or not, hopefully many of them do, many of them won't. And the only requirement is that companies make the plastic water bottles recyclable, not ensure that they are recycled. Now, this is particularly interesting to me because not only does the UK have a very good standard of drinking water, there are now increasing studies that are concerned with the amount of plastic toxins that we ingest when we drink plastic bottled water. But not just because of ourselves, though it's tempting to be anthropocentric, but also as to how we then release that plastic as it passes, to use a proverbial term, back into the ecosystem. And in a recent enough analysis of 250 bottles of water from different countries, of those, the conclusion was that the average bottle of water contains 10 plastic particles, which are larger in width than a human hair. So it's not just our own organic ecosystems internally, it's the world around us that kind of get affected by that, and the plastification of our water supply. Now, in response to some things like what I've just been saying, more recently, plastic bottles have become less cool than they were perhaps, say, a decade ago, or maybe even 20 years ago, where it was very, very common to be carrying around a nice bottle of water that you paid far too much for. And similarly, in some circles, you may now be shunned for carrying around your bottle of water. Working where I do, I'm sure that there's been a real change away from using plastic bottles to reusable ones. And why is that? Well, it might be because the impact of bottled water on ecosystems is 1,400 times higher than that of tap water. So if we think about the impact of each and every liter of bottled water, it's having 1,400 times more impact on the ecosystem than 1 liter of tap water. Okay, so that's a crazy fact. And on that note, I'd like to go to the audience for a little while, just for a minute or so, and just to ask you, do you drink bottled water? If yes, why? If no, why not? And be quite open about this if you want, because I occasionally do drink bottled water myself for various reasons. So let's see if anything comes up. Okay, I see a comment here about a climate-friendly menu. Now, I'm not, despite my appearance, an expert gastronomist, although I am an aspiring one. I'd say anything that you can see that grows in your local environment and regional environment. But I'm not here to really suggest that. I'm just highlighting what we do or what I do, and kind of open myself up vulnerably to start thinking more and reflect more on the everyday and the mundane as to how we encounter our very complex ecosystem. Okay, so a few people here saying we don't yes, paid for, I used to live in Scotland, and tap water was there was a slang term for it called council juice, which I quite liked. Consideration geography is important. Awesome. So Alistair's chipped in too. Yeah, but we have to bear in mind that we do lead busy lives, right? So, you know, it may happen that we are thirsty and all we can access is bottled water, in which case our preference may not be available. Okay, so we need to think about that. And it is good to see that there is more and more availability of bottled water. Of tap water. There certainly is a lot of bottled water available. But even so, you know, we could have more. Okay, but I do think it's better than it used to be, even say 5 or 10 years ago. So that's something. Having said that, on my local campus, they've just ripped out a few of the free water machines. So I'm not sure what's happened there, but you can always use a tap if you need to. Remember, the UK has some of the best tap water in the world. Yeah. Good to know that there's bubbles in the tap water. I don't know, that might put me off, but I'll give it a go. Okay, so I've worked up a bit of an appetite now. And contrary to what you might expect, or maybe exactly what you might expect, I am a meat eater. And I have been since birth, which is not to excuse it, but to, again, bring in my own complicity in supporting this system. And to myself, the specific act of consuming the meat is less the issues that I face individually in terms of morally, ethically, than the way in which this meat is made available to us. Okay, so we don't kill our own food. And I say we, but generalizing, most of us will not kill our own food. We will receive it very tidily wrapped in individual packages, which obscures the origins and reality of what is involved in getting it to our fridges. Okay, never mind, you know, the kind of costs that Alistair was mentioning, but just the other ones that also creep in. So here's an example: some chicken pieces, tasty. Maybe not now. You know, this represents 6 individual chickens, which were raised, slaughtered, butchered, and then packaged into these very convenient stackable plastic items, right? And there's my fruit on top of it. Who knows? Fruit is chicken. Why not? So here's an interesting point that comes up. Okay, how do we value animal life? Is killing 50 chickens as bad as 1 cow in terms of the meat that they produce, or is it all bad and therefore we are all bad for perpetuating it? I'm not offering the answers. So if you wanted the answer, you may have to look within yourself. But to kind of put it a bit differently and to think about it a bit differently, here's some corned beef. I've gone for the cheap stuff too, even better. Now, I know some people think it's gross. I prefer to ham byproduct stuff. I'm trying to not use brands, if you noticed, in this presentation. Now, what's quite interesting about corned beef, even though it is kind of gross, I admit, is that how far away it comes from. So this one here in particular comes from Brazil, which is quite interesting. So there's a huge amount of shipping that's involved in bringing this humble product to my store and therefore to me when I buy it. And there's a trade-off here, because these are all the parts of the cows that people generally don't want to eat, that are then mushed up, right, and corned. So on one hand, it's slightly better that we're not wasting all of that, but then what about the environmental costs of shipping this product? You know, but it does kind of make the most of scraps of meat that wouldn't be desirable or edible otherwise. But we need to also bear in mind that in many countries, availability of food and lacking availability means that these types of products are a huge source of protein, fats. So in the Caribbean, many countries will depend on imported meat of this nature because of the steady deconstruction of their own systems of agriculture by external countries. Which is why if you go to the World Foods aisle in your local superstore, you'll often find corned beef in the Caribbean food section. And that is one reason why. Now, as I said, I don't have answers, and I'm as involved as any human living within this global food metastructure and weird and sometimes wonderful hopefully, planet that we all share. But I'm prompting myself and all of us to think about our foods the next time we have a very mundane, perhaps Sunday afternoon, to have a look at where these tomatoes come from and where the ground coffee is produced and what has gone into producing it and why it's 60% more than it used to be. And I think as long as we think about it, that's good enough for me. Okay, so it's gotten a bit heavy and bloody with all that meat. Let's cool down with some cola. So this is my preferred one of the fizzy water purveyors. And I'm fully aware that it is overpriced chemicals and water. I am very aware of that. But let's think about that a bit. How much water? Well, in 2020, the parent company of this fine product consumed more than 28 billion liters of water. That was last year. Now, the good news is that for now, the same company is also aiming to replenish more water than they use within 10 years. So by 2030. We'll see if that happens. But that's something, this kind of net zero messaging. Is it enough? Let's put it a bit differently. So as an aside to this, in 2020, again, in Detroit, Michigan, USA, large bottled water producers, including the ones that also do that fine fizzy dark colored beverage and with extra spicy chemicals in it, they also bottle water. And in Detroit last year, impoverished local residents had their running water shut off for not paying their bills on time, which begs the question, is the human right access to clean water is therefore being denied? That's another point. And at the same time, these large companies were able to keep bottling water in the same city. Now, already some people might find that a bit unfair, but it gets stranger. The weird thing is that last year, in addition to those impoverished residents who couldn't pay their water bills, having their water cut off, these large bottlers were also late on their water bills and didn't pay them on time, but did not have their water cut off. Why is that? You're welcome to answer in the chat, in the comments if you want. I'll move on though, because I think we're getting towards the end of this session, and what's a good way to end? What do I have around me? Aha, okay. I have adopted this country as my own, and therefore I'm going to end with a classic, a bit of cheese. Does anyone in the audience know, on average, so a wild guess is fine, how many liters of milk are used to make 1 kilogram of cheese? Okay, so if you think about it in weights, how many liters of milk per 1 kilogram of cheese? Okay, the answer is 10 liters. So for an easy reference point, think about it as the 10-to-1 ratio. Okay, so every kilogram of cheese or pound of cheese is 10 pounds of milk or 10 liters of water per kilo. Okay. But when we're thinking, very good, Fitz, you got it. I mean, I'd already given the answer at that point, but if there's a delay, I'll let you have it. So there's no prize, sadly. No cheese for you, unless you go and get your own. You're welcome to. But when we're thinking about dairy, we need to think about who's worst off. And here I'm going to diverge a bit and not talk about the cows and the calves, because we've all, many of us have seen Cowspiracy and these types of programs. Instead, I'm going to talk about human. And globally, the cost of our dairy often be human. So farmers face having to deal with lower profits, needing to keep up with new technology, and of course, the same spiraling food prices that we all face, as Alistair mentioned. And their living costs have now led to the farmer lifestyle no longer being viable. And with our modernizing cultures, who wants to work long hours on a dairy farm? I doubt I would. So in the UK, labor shortages are what have often posed a massive barrier to keeping the dairy industry sustainable. And that's not even if we think about whether we want to sustain it, or whether in an age of unprecedented global wealth, we can legitimately recommend such forms of hard manual labor to people as a decent form of work, thinking to the SDGs. So what I think for now is that if we keep wanting to, we may need to enjoy our cheese while it lasts, and maybe get used to not eating quite so much of it. I'll try until Christmas. And before I finish, I wanted to mention that as much of this food as possible is being donated to my local food bank and homeless shelter. And I would urge you to, if you haven't looked into it already, try and support your local community and look into your local food bank if you have one nearby. Unfortunately, most of us do. And as we draw this session to a close, I would like you to please post any final comments or ideas you have into the comments or chat area. This is the first time that we have run this overview, so we're keen to keep developing our ideas and our points of focus. For instance, do you have a particular food that you find interesting, sustainable, or worrying? Let us know. Keep the dialogue open. And for now, from me and Alistair, we'd like to thank you very much for taking part, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Alistair, where are you? Hit me up, bro.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. It was great to have your contributions and some interesting discussions going on in the side. So thank you, and yeah, do stay involved in the festival.